Okay, good afternoon. State Representative Dave Pinto here. I'm represent the southwest part of St. Paul, and I'm the DFL lead on the Fraud Prevention and State Agency Oversight Committee. I also serve as a prosecutor outside the legislature. I appreciate everybody being here. I had the chance to look at the press conference that that occurred a couple hours ago from our colleagues, several of them serving on that committee, and have a few thoughts. Wanted to recognize that we have a number of folks here who are authors of provisions that are in fact moving in our various budget bills to address fraud, both fraud on public programs and fraud more broadly. We know that that fraud is an issue that is expanding throughout our economy, our society. There are people who are taking advantage of vulnerable people. They're doing so of people who are benefiting from public programs and need the benefit of those programs, and on consumers and businesses and government more broadly. And we want to continue to take action against that fraud. There's a handout that we will be getting to you if we haven't already that looks at many of the progress, much of the progress that was made in the 2023-2024 legislative session that built on progress in prior sessions, and then proud to say that we're taking action this session as well. I'll have some more thoughts at the end about how the Fraud Prevention and State Agency Oversight Committee ties into the proposals and the provisions that are moving. I will say that very few of them have actually moved through that committee, and which has been a challenge for those of us on that committee. But I'm glad that in many other committees that there's been a lot of important work that's been done. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the pieces that are moving through, and then again at the end we'll circle back to talking further about the committee. I'm going to ask Representative Steve Elkins to talk about a couple pieces, and then Representative Emma Greenman. We're the three who are the DFL members of the Fraud Prevention Committee. Representative Elkins.
Thank you. A member of the committee, and sponsored one of the provisions that is being carried in the larger bills related to data sharing. So one of the problems that we need to solve is that, for example, if we want authoritative income and employment data, we would need to go to DEED. If you need source of truth for births and deaths, we would need to go to the Department of Health for that kind of information. So behind the scenes, Minute, through its Technical Advisory Commission and Data Sharing Subcommittee, is already exploring, has been for several months now, how we would go about making it easier to share data across agencies to do fraud detection and prevention activities. That work will be ongoing and is supported by legislation that we're poised to pass this year as well.
Okay, good. Mr. Green?
And I am Representative Emma Greenman. I represent South Minneapolis in the House. And I think to restate what Co-Chair Pinto said is we have started every Monday morning for 3 months talking about what we were hoping to talk about. What we wanted to talk about was how do we protect vulnerable people, how do we protect the services that they rely on from fraudsters who will take advantage of that. And unfortunately, for week after week, what we got was what felt like a very political piece and also not very useful, because the last hearing we had was about, we actually got the Medicaid control unit who came in. I heard them in public safety 2 months ago, and they actually started to talk about the details of the fraud and the business model of fraud that we were trying to prevent. Unfortunately, it was after most of our committees had written their bills with really good, important things in them. And that's the language that we wanted to be talking about. The last thing I'll say is, in public safety, I heard Superintendent Drew Evans say that fraud is a problem across our economy. It's raised 25% in the last year, just consumer fraud. And so the fact that we're not, in that committee, we had not had one conversation about fraud that's going after our seniors, fraud that's going after our veterans, fraud that's going after our small businesses, to me means we weren't really talking about fraud at all. It was an attack on the governor. It was an attack on our agencies that provide these services. And as we saw a couple weeks ago, it's an attack on the Attorney General's office that's actually doing amazing work to fight fraud and abuse that's aimed after our seniors, our veterans, and our government services that are providing real benefit and important benefit to people. And so that's, I think I'll turn it back over to
Pinto. Yeah, and I'll note we have Chair Mahmoud Noor from the Human Services Committee. Just yesterday, we passed Human Services Finance and Policy bills that contained a number of provisions that fight fraud. We can certainly have you direct questions to him if you're interested. Chair Jenny Cleavorn from our State Government Committee, budget bill that she passed contained a number of provisions as well. My own committee in the jobs area contains language to fight misclassification. Representative Greenman has led on that. That's a form of fraud, not only on employees and workers, on fellow businesses and on government as well. Chair Khadija Watoon from the Children and Families Committee. What I want to emphasize is that these are a series of provisions, and I should note actually Representative Matt Norris here as well, who worked on proposal from the Attorney General relating to Medicaid fraud. These are all provisions that have been advanced forward, very often with DFL authorship, of course, ultimately end up getting bipartisan support, which is the nature of our tied House. I'm the author of the bill from the governor with a comprehensive anti-fraud package. These are all provisions moving forward. I will note, having listened to the press conference earlier, there were 3 bills that in the course of the 10 weeks that we heard, all informationally, the only one of those bills moving forward at all is the governor's anti-fraud package, pieces of that moving forward as I referenced. There were 2 bills we heard yesterday that will not move forward, did not receive a hearing. And so it's interesting, as I was preparing for this and to be talking to you and educating myself about the different pieces, it's hard to track things. It's funny, service on the Fraud Prevention Committee did not inform somebody very well about the actual anti-fraud provisions that are moving out in the various bills because they didn't end up coming in front of our committee. Appreciate many of the conversations that we had and happy to get into that. But I do want to note that the work that's being done to fight fraud is work that's been happening for a number of years. It's continuing to happen this session, and it's very much the people standing behind me and others as well who've been leading on a lot of that work in collaboration with others as well. I think that we probably for now have addressed what we wanted to in terms of initial remarks. Again, there's folks here who can answer questions and happy to talk with you.
What about the partisanship or bipartisanship? Obviously, it was the only House committee that Republicans retained a majority on. How did you feel like it was run?
Yeah, I think certainly the aspects of, how the actual process and the hearings and all worked, I think reasonably fair. I will note that the one time that we really learned about or received information that somebody might think would really educate about the detail of what fraud is going on, it was a group, the Center of the American Experiment, that presented, right-wing a group that had somebody who presented who indicated that it really wasn't based on research that he had done. That obviously does not say good things. I'll note also that just before the committee met, there was a letter that our colleagues sent. I'm going to turn to Representative Greenman to discuss that.
So to the point about how we started this committee, it wasn't just the makeup. It was that before we even met, we saw this letter that Republican leadership, along with Chair Robbins, sent to Attorney General Pam Bondi to investigate Governor Walz. Now, we know about this president, that he is famous for going after his political enemies. The idea that the Republican leadership would say, let's have a serious conversation about this, entering in to the committee while sending a letter to Attorney General Bondi to investigate Trump's political enemy just doesn't start with a conversation about what we're talking about is actually protecting taxpayers, government services, and the people who rely on them. What this says is this is a political project from the beginning, and I felt, before we stepped one foot into the building.
And I'll just, one other note. I've had very constructive conversation with Chair Robbins. You'll note she had referenced a letter that was sent jointly by all members of the committee. That was very constructive, and I certainly, I guess it's my nature to hope and expect that we can continue to work to a productive place. Certainly many of the anti-fraud provisions that I referenced have bipartisan support. But at this point in the work the committee's done, I don't know that there's a lot that we can point to that the committee has identified thus far in terms of accomplishments.
So this isn't a committee that you would continue if you had the choice?
Well, I think we'd want to see, I mean, what I'll say is the work of the legislature, the work of the House is so much done in committees that ultimately we present proposals in the form of bills, right? And so I think it was not clear at the very beginning, is this a committee that's going to be actually doing that? How's that going to work? I would say we're all concerned about making sure that public funds are used in good ways. But as far as this particular structural innovation, I don't know. We'll have to, I guess, continue to see whether it makes a lot of sense. So far, I wouldn't say it's added a ton.
Do you think this committee achieved anything that couldn't have been achieved in, say, another committee like state and local government, for instance?
It's hard for me to think that there was something that was achieved that couldn't have been achieved in one of those committees, in another committee. I'm not trying to disagree, but yeah.
Sorry.
Please.
I think all of you guys on the committee, Republicans, Democrats, if not all of them, most of you signed the letter about the legislatively named grants.
We all did.
Yes, which sounds like there is nothing really moving on that issue, but one of the things Representative Robbins said was potentially for next year, anytime there is a legislatively named grant, there would be something similar to this pre-award risk assessment, which I'm assuming the state agencies are doing right now. But like that, anytime you put this, nonprofit in law of getting X amount of dollars, you would do some of these same things. Do you guys support that concept? Or what is your solution to the legislative?
It is actually law, so that is required right now. It passed in 23-24. There has to be a pre-award risk assessment. That is current law and was passed under the DFL majority last term.
Isn't this for RFPs for state agent? It's for legislatively named grants too.
That's-
You are doing risk assessments like this.
The state agencies right now, any organization that receives funding, including directly appropriated funding, yes, goes through that. It's one reason that you'll hear from organizations, even if they received a direct appropriation, it can take quite a while because there's quite an extensive process that goes through before they can receive those. So we put in very extensive checks, and that are summarized quite well in that.
And if you want the legislative site,
Well,
Chair Norrie?
if you wanted to look at the legislation that we passed, it's 16B.198, so.
There's the expertise.
Just say it.
Yeah.
As far as the OIG bill goes, how do you feel about the version that's coming out of the House compared to what we're seeing in the Senate?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that is great about the OIG bill is the process that it's been going through. I think Minnesotans can feel really good about that process. It's what I think most Minnesotans expect when they send their legislators to the Capitol. We had Democrats and Republicans from both the House and the Senate meeting every Tuesday for several weeks, really talking about the different aspects of the various proposals in the House and the Senate, trying to figure out, how could we come to language that all four caucuses could enthusiastically support. I know the bill in the Senate is moving. I think it's sitting right now in Senate Finance and is up for a hearing again tomorrow. I think it's the version that's sitting in Senate Finance right now has made a lot of progress from the bill that was initially introduced either here on the Senate side or here on the House side. I'm not sure that either caucus on the House side is fully on board with the current Senate language in its totality, but I'm hopeful that if we continue that process that we've been going through, working with all four caucuses together, we can hopefully get to language that all four caucuses can really strongly support.
Executive or legislative oversight?
That's something that continues to be in discussion. I'm not going to negotiate here through the press, but that certainly is a key difference between some of the positions that have been introduced in the various bodies.
How do you feel about where that's at in the House version? Executive versus legislative?
Yeah, so the bill that I'm carrying has it in the executive branch. We have not, the House bill has not moved recently. The Senate is kind of leading the process on that currently. And then, I think it sounds like the Senate is planning to send the bill over here to the House. And then I think we'll take that up and see if we can, get everything buttoned up on that and something that can pass the House too.
You guys are all good with the
HF3 that got into the state, your rep or Chair Cleavorn, your state and local government.
So House File 3 is working with the legislative auditor to make sure that recommendations that are made by the auditor are implemented. The questions that we raised in committee were the fact that the legislative auditor can make recommendations, but those recommendations are supposed to come back to the legislature. And it is incumbent upon the legislators to decide whether or not we want to really push the agencies to implement those recommendations. The concerns that I have with House File 3, as I've stated to Co-Chair Nash, is that it gives the weight of the recommendation the weight of law. And that is not what the recommendations are supposed to be. And you always have to remember that a legislative auditor's report is a snapshot in time. So in that particular moment, at that particular day, this is what the OLA saw, which is fine. That's what we should know. But there's also the legislature that is responsible. For example, I pushed back against the auditor for the state auditor's office, because the state auditor had been asking the legislature for funding to do the very things that the state auditor was being held accountable for. Well, if we don't fund them, they can't do the work that they're being required to do. So the recommendations are that, and we as chairs of committees that are responsible have a duty and obligation to follow those recommendations and see where we think it is best to put state resources.
Can I just say something as a member of the Legislative Audit Commission, which is, we are the policymakers. At the end of the day, our job is to pass bills through the House and the Senate and give to the governor that are making policy and are guidance and advising. The auditor, their job, they have auditing skills, right, to look at processes. We heard a lot of audit reports in the Fraud Committee. I have been on the Audit Commission for now 3 years, but in reality, it's neither what the voters want nor how government works that we would somehow outsource our policymaking and recommendations, our government oversight to the legislative auditor. They're not built for that. And frankly, I think that is an abdication of our obligation in this House to make those recommendations that are really policy recommendations about how agencies should function and how they should serve people, as opposed to process recommendations, which is how you store paperwork and things like that.
I know one of the governor's proposals was using kind of expanding or pushing the use of AI to try to have fraud detection early before money goes out the door. I think that's in one of your bills and the Senate bills. Can someone give an update on that and what kind of difference you think that might be?
I'm going to go to,
Well, I think,
oh, that's yours, yeah.
Well, it was part of the package that we got it. It's in the governor's recommendation. We did not adopt the AI because we're putting we did not. We're putting more resources of getting people to do the work itself. We've got a few things that we have improved our bill when it comes to increasing some of the surcharge fees so that we can be able to hire more individuals, because you need more individuals who can have eyes on what is happening. And we're doing few things. Number one, we're doing steps for success for anybody who's doing any programming so that they can be informed, engaged, so they know exactly what to do. But we're also doing early and often, instead of just waiting for 5 years or 3 years, we're making sure that they can get a visit from someone in office of OIG so that we can be able to really address the issue of fraud, waste, and abuse. We're putting some moratorium in place. If there is an increase in any program, we're doing licensure for EIDBI. We're also putting some guardrails in some of the other programs. So there's a lot that we passed last night, and this is because we had a bipartisan support both from the GOP and the Democrats to get it done.
and I would just add that from the work that I've been doing on data management, that before we could really put AI to good use, we have a lot of work to do to just integrate and clean up our data so that before we can point an AI engine against it.
I want to ask about something that Representative Robbins said earlier in their press conference. He said DFL colleagues were frustrated that we didn't dive more into specifics with investigators or the business model of fraud. They invited many of those people. They declined our invitation because they didn't want to expose the tricks of the trade. Do you want to elaborate on what she's referring to?
Yeah, I mean, so one can certainly understand that there might be some reluctance to describe, this is exactly how we identify fraud. I mean, I will say, So I wrote out the 10 hearings that we had, and, the first one, the legislative auditor discussed a report that had been issued several years prior, then we had a series of state agencies. It makes a lot of sense to me that an individual investigator wouldn't come in and say, this is exactly how we identify fraud. On the other hand, I think finally at this last hearing, as Representative Greenman referenced, I'm having the Medicaid fraud unit in the Attorney General's office, and they emphasized at the beginning, we can't get into a lot of exactly how we do things, but they were able to describe a lot about what they've seen, a lot of patterns, and that was investigators actually talking about, and the prosecutors within the Attorney General's office talking about what they were seeing, versus so many of the other ones were agencies in general coming under fire in ways that they would not necessarily have those insights. So, sure, it makes sense to me investigators would be reluctant to share those tricks of the trade, but I certainly think that there's more that we could be seeing, and again, we did finally in this most recent hearing.
Representative Pinto, how do you think these fraud negotiations will go and how they will fit in with the end of session budget and everything else? Is this likely to be smoother or equally?
Well, and again, to emphasize, so I think it's sort of, ends up being confusing here, right? Because there's the committee, and we've talked about, had those hearings and had a couple informational hearings on bills that are not moving forward. Really, the anti-fraud work is happening in the individual budget bills, right? It's the work of Chair Noor and Human Services, and Chair Schumacher, his counterpart, Chairs Cleavorn and Nash, in each of those budget areas. And I think in many cases, these are things that have strong bipartisan support. Certainly the House GOP and House DFL have worked together to advance these things, very often with DFL authors, but sometimes with GOP authors. So I don't know that there's sort of fraud negotiations. I think what it is in each of these budget areas, the leaders in those areas are advancing. I guess that's where I kind of want to make sure we're noticing is that it's sort of easy to talk in generalities about fraud, and perhaps that has an effect of undermining faith in government, et cetera. We really want to do is recognize that, yep, we agree fraud is bad, and let's take action on it in a well-informed and concrete way, and that's what's happening in these various bills.
Did you write that on your phone?
There were some jokes about.
So it's easy to say fraud is bad. That's a bumper sticker. I think actually protecting people and the services that they rely on, protecting taxpayers, requires a stack of bills that we have been working through. And so, again, I think if it's a political slogan, yeah, you can write it on your hand. You can print a letter. But that's actually not going to help the people of Minnesota. It's not going to help ensure that we're protecting our budgets, and it's certainly not going to help the folks the seniors and the kids and the veterans and who we are looking to protect. So I do think it's funny and weird that he wrote that on his hand, but I don't actually think that that's useful, right? Like what's useful is, it's like a bumper sticker is not useful. What's useful is the work that people have been doing, again, in a bipartisan way. There's been lots of things, but that's the work that I think we have been, three of us, continually asking. I mean, I asked every day for 2 months, when are we going to bring in the Medicaid Fraud Control Unit? Because we keep hearing about their work. And I heard Representative Norris's bill in public safety, and it was great. And I heard Superintendent Drew Evans talk about not just fraud on government, but fraud on consumers, fraud on Minnesotans. And so I think as we move forward, we actually need to broaden that conversation. I really appreciate it, and I will take the opportunity to say, when we talk about misclassification fraud, when we talk about consumer fraud, there's Representative Moeller has a bill about defrauding seniors. Like, these are all things that are moving forward, and that is the work that we should be doing, not bumper sticker slogans.
May I ask you a question about your state government bill?
Certainly, go ahead.
Before the omnibus DE and then the final product that was voted on the floor, there was a provision or a big section establishing a code of ethics for the legislature, expanding what that looks like for lawmakers, because some kind of good government transparency advocates have been concerned about what Minnesota's rules are. Can you speak to that, why that wasn't in there, or what that looks like for the future?
Certainly. The reason that I removed that provision from the bill is because that's a provision that came from the governor's office to direct the behavior of the legislature. I was concerned that there could be constitutionality issues about that. The legislature can have its own code of conduct, and we should be writing that ourselves. I have reached out to advocates who are very concerned about conflict of interest and making sure that we have the right code of conduct and the right code of ethics. And that is something that I'm dedicated to, and I will continue to do that work. And it will be a House-led bill, not a governor-led bill. Thank you.
What might the work of the fraud committee for Pinto, what might the work of the fraud committee look like under a DFL majority that in the future hypothetically chooses to keep it around?
Right, well, there's a lot of hypotheticals there. I have to sort of get my head around that a little bit. I mean, I think maybe what I'll do is direct your attention to the last time there was a DFL majority, which was 23-24, and the handout that was distributed. Exactly how the committee structure would work, we'd have to sort of see, but I think what you'd see is those of us who fundamentally believe that public services are really important for people who need them and people who are vulnerable, especially want to make sure that funds that are allocated for those purposes actually go to those public services and to those people who need them. So I think you would see a continued focus, as there's been for a number of years now, on making sure that that actually happens. We've got a summary of those things in 23-24, and I think you'd continue to see that under a DFL majority as well, regardless of the exact committee structure, which, as you all know, changes every 2 years anyway.
I think I'm hearing you guys say that this problem of fraud isn't unique to this state, which is obviously true. This Feeding Our Future, for example, and what we're looking at with some of the autism centers now maybe, are among the biggest frauds in the country. And why are they here instead of in Florida or somewhere else?
Yeah, please, yeah.
So, you ask a really great question. And so as Representative Norris and I were working on the OIG bill with our colleagues in the Senate, we invited in other OIGs from other states. And they said, in fact, COVID set up a perfect storm. And so with trying to get money out so that people can actually be fed, it gave all across our country an opportunity for criminal enterprise and creative people to step in and try to set up different types of frauds, different frauds in different states. But in fact, it was something that we did see all across our nation, and we heard that from several OIGs around the country.
But the biggest ones are here. We see it, I've seen it in Arizona, I've seen it in Florida, but the biggest ones are here.
Yeah, I mean, well, one thing is you're seeing, so I know that we heard from the Attorney General's staff on Monday that for Medicaid fraud investigation and prosecution units of their size, we lead the country in terms of convictions. And so I think to some extent, I would hope that part of it would be that we have better detection and going after it more effectively. And I would say that, it's what we know is that any time that there are vulnerable people, that there are going to be those who try to exploit them. I should have noted earlier in response to the question about a DFL majority actions that we did so much in the last 2 years and before, not just to address fraud in public programs, to address fraud against consumers, against workers and businesses, much of that led by Representative Greenman and many of the others who are up here. And I certainly know that with the DFL majority, you'd continue to see that broader focus of all the ways that people are being defrauded. But I think that in part, we're going after it more aggressively, and we know just there's always more to do. However we compare ourselves to other states, this is incredibly important.
You may have heard Representative Hudson in the press conference said that there's a culture of fraud in this administration. What's your response to that?
I don't know that there's any evidence for that. We know in working with state agencies, they are committed to addressing the fraud that is happening on public programs and more broadly as well. There may be colleagues who want to add something to that. Yeah, please.
I would just say, because I think we hear that a lot, which is we're talking about private provider fraud. And when you hear Representative Hudson, whoever else, sort of try to shoehorn that into, we're not talking about government officials, we're not talking about government corruption. We haven't seen a single case of that. We do in a bunch of other states. And so I think that when we hear you get very close to this insinuation that somehow we're going to spend an hour and 45 minutes listening to a video that, or a leaked report that all it showed me was what fraudsters do, not what any of our government officials do. All we have seen, whether it's from the Medicaid Fraud Control Unit, whether it's from the work that DEED and MDE have been doing over the last 4 years to actually address the problem, both put it into statute, is that government is trying to respond to this rapid increase of fraud. And so when Superintendent Drew Evans says that Visa spent $12.5 billion to fight fraud, and when he says that in the last year there's been a 25% reporting of fraud, what we know is that fraud, and what he also said was fraud is victim agnostic, which is you find a vulnerability and you go after it. And so when we hear someone like Representative Hudson make those insinuations, and usually based on things that they carried around this fraud tracker that if you watch our whole hearing on it is inaccurate to the point of misleading. What they're trying to do is cast political aspersions, and I think this goes back to the work of this committee, and the work was supposed to be what we thought was happening in every other committee, which was actually looking at figuring out the problem, diagramming the business model, and trying to, for a lack of a better term, harden government as a target for fraud. And that is not what Representative Hudson spent his time doing. What he spent his time doing is going after Attorney General Ellison and his office. And that's not going to get us any closer as it relates to the people of Minnesota to helping them get the benefits that they are entitled to, helping us ensure that we're taking care of people.
You mentioned the Attorney General. What about the governor, though? It's been asserted, the other side of the aisle, that the governor didn't get after the fraud, didn't address it quickly enough.
It's the same thing. They're doing the same thing. It's just one is Governor Walz and one is Attorney General Ellison. What they're saying, again, this is the culture of fraud. There's a lot of insinuation. But everything I see is the last, that long list of reforms that many of them were proposed by the governor or working with the governor in the House and the Senate. Those were not led by the GOP. They could have been, but they weren't. And so I think that is, again, as I hear my Republican colleagues across the aisle both say, on the one hand, we want this to be the work of bipartisanship and we care about protecting the needy, not the greedy, I think Representative Robbins has said. And then on the other hand, go after government workers without any evidence, and insinuate that there's somehow a culture that they won't even spend time actually trying to figure out the private provider fraud. Because again, all the allegations, even on that list of the Center of the American Experiment, is about private, whether they're private, for-profit, nonprofit, doesn't matter. They're about private providers who figured out a vulnerability and created a business model to exploit that vulnerability. And government is trying to keep up in the same way that credit card companies are, in the same way that we are all trying to keep up on attacks on our own personal information. And so that, to me, is what we should be focused on. How do we harden the target of government? How do we protect Minnesotans? That's not what Representative Hudson meant in that case. And so I just say it's hard to respond to an unserious comment.
A reminder, there was MDE that identified the concerns with this federal program and reported to the FBI and attempted to cut off payments. Several of us will need to run shortly to Ways and Means. Maybe just do one final question if there is one, and perhaps there's not. We really appreciate your work, and certainly feel free to connect with any of us at any time. Thank you, and thank you all.
Mary, I brought...